Okay, so are we ready to start? Let's have a look to see if there's anyone on the robot. No. So then let's start because I need official presentation, official introduction.
Oh, official.
Actually, that's a multilingual event. For that reason, we'll make it a little bit multilingual. Although I never speak German in this classroom, it's only French or English, but never mind. I have made an exception already today. Also meine Damen und Herren, es ist ganz komisch, jetzt Deutsch zu sprechen. Meine Damen und Herren, es freut mich sehr, dass Sie alle hier sind. Vielen Dank für Ihre Anwesenheit und später auch für Ihre Partizipation an der Diskussion, wie ich hoffe. Und wir haben also vor dem Vortrag von Herrn Fleming, dann Fragerunde und dann ist da auch nicht viel, aber so ein bisschen noch zum Knabbern und zu trinken. Und da wir in dem Sprachenlabor hier offiziell nichts trinken dürfen, ich meine, wenn Studierende das machen, man kann nicht hier 1,5 Stunden sitzen, ohne zu trinken, sage ich nichts. Aber eigentlich dürfen wir das nicht, würden wir dann uns so ein bisschen auf den Flur verlegen. Und das ist da auch kuschelig. Also insofern. So, also im Namen des Sprachenrats Saar, dessen Vorsitzender ich die Ehre zu sein habe, und der Hochschule für Technik und Wirtschaft des Saarlandes als gemeinsame Veranstaltung begrüße ich Sie heute. Mein Name ist Thomas Tinnefeld. Ich bin, wenn man die HTW jetzt zugrunde legt, hier Professor für angewandte Sprachen. Und das ist das erste von einer hoffentlich Reihe loser Webinare oder auch Seminare, Vorträge, die wir jetzt in der Zukunft haben werden. Alors, soyez tous et toutes les bienvenus ce soir, juste pour dire quelques mots en français. Hein? Parce que M. Fleming vient du Canada, donc c'est donc l'anglais et le français, les deux. Et c'est quand même multilingue, alors évidemment multilingue, c'est pourquoi je dois le faire, et c'est mon plaisir de le faire. Alors, encore une fois, herzlich willkommen, welcome, bienvenue, bienvenidos, Juan Ing, fragen wir meine Freunde, ob die alle aussprechen warten.
Gut, sehr gut.
Willkommen auf Schwedisch, was ich ein bisschen dabei bin, mir anzueignen. So now we switch back to English, so I haven't said anything impolite or
Actually, wouldn't.
So, ladies and gentlemen, as you know, on behalf of the Language Council of Saarland and Saarland University of Applied Sciences, it's my great pleasure to introduce our today's guest speaker, Professor Douglas Fleming from Ottawa, Canada, whose work in the field of education and language is nothing short of remarkable. Professor Fleming's career has been marked by a strong dedication to research, teaching, and the pursuit of knowledge. With a keen focus we actually cut it out later. With a keen focus on English as a second language, citizenship, and critical pedagogy, he has reached deep insight into language education. He brings his passion and expertise to both graduate and undergraduate courses, where he explores current social and political issues in second language research, ESL methodology, and program development. The promotion of multicultural citizenship education, equity and language policy is not just his profession, it's his calling. What truly sets Professor Fleming apart is his commitment to practical application, and that's actually what we do here as well at this university. We're very practice-oriented, with over 50 publications and invited contributions like this one. He has actively contributed to professional, curriculum and material development, and for government projects, social districts, teacher associations, non-governmental associations, and the like. If I do this work, now you know what you have done.
Yeah, I know. This is going to be a hard act of fun.
So his work reaches beyond the classroom and into the hands of those who can really effect change. In recognition of his exceptional contributions, Professor Fleming was awarded a New Scholar Fellowship Award by the Canadian Society for Studies in Education in 2010. Now we're getting very much into the past. Before earning his PhD in Language and Literacy Education from the University of British Columbia in 2007, Professor Fleming spent 20 years as an administrator and teacher in Toronto, Ontario, and Surrey in British Columbia. His practical expertise enriches his academic insights and provides a well-rounded perspective are the challenges and opportunities within the field of language education. Et le professeur Fleming a déjà été à ça. Alors, c'est-à-dire qu'en 2019, lors du 5e congrès Saar de l'enseignement des langues étrangères que j'organise ici, alors que j'ai organisé, mais c'est un civil congrès, on s'est rencontrés pour la première fois. Alors, on s'est trouvé sympathique, c'est-à-dire que là, je n'en dis pas trop. Ah, il réfléchit encore. Et alors, cette année, en mai, que j'ai eu le plaisir de le revoir quand j'ai participé activement à un congrès à Ottawa, au Canada, lors du thème de ce soir, et j'ai présidé une discussion et j'ai donné une conférence aussi en français sur la stratégie France de Saar. Et c'est là où l'on a quand même approfondi notre relation personnelle un tout petit peu. Das heißt, dass also dieses Wiedersehen, wo mich ein Kollege von Herrn Fleming, Professor Slavkov, Nikolaus Slavkov, eingeladen hat, war eigentlich ganz schön. Wir haben sehr viel uns erzählt und gemacht und Herr Fleming hat, wann immer wir jemanden trafen, der vorbeikam, gesagt, would you like to know this person? Hat er mich vorgestellt. Introduce me to anyone passing by. That's what I found most nice of you.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, because at least I got to know a lot of people. They will all have forgotten me, but never mind. Okay. So, but now let's talk about the talk. Professor Fleming brings a wealth of knowledge and a passion for today's subject of bilingualism and plurilingualism in Canada. He will help us to better understand the complexities and intricacies of language in this diverse nation. So in this case, we talked about it when coming here. Canada can be compared to Germany to a certain extent in terms of migration, and of course it can be compared to Saarland in terms of its bilingual state. And I had a very interesting, I don't want to take too much of time, experience when from Ottawa I just crossed the river, a big river there, and went into the next city. You can do that on foot, which is called Gatineau, and this is in Quebec, and there English is a minority language, not French. So in Quebec it's the other way around, and that's what I even could feel. Perhaps it was auto-suggestion, or perhaps I was auto-hypnotized, but I could feel that it was more French than Ottawa, for example, although Ottawa is very French as well. Okay, so we will now learn about the interplay between ethnic and cultural origins, languages, and Canada's linguistic legacy. We will be presented with the profound respect Canada offers to the heritage of First Nations nowadays, the understanding of the situation and the importance of migrants, and the ever-evolving trends in language. Professor Fleming will thus guide us through the multifaceted terrain of bilingualism. You can start small, don't go. We will also have insights into the historical undercurrents which have shaped Canada's present linguistic situation. Detailing French immersion programming, will add a unique perspective to our discussion today. All in all, so it will be coming, so be quick. All in all, we will not only explore the current state of bilingualism in Canada together, but also the tensions it might entail. Yeah. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in extending a warm welcome to Professor Douglas Fleming.
And give as much time for discussion and questions and so on as possible. So I'm going to run through the PowerPoint fairly quickly. The PowerPoint has been posted on my website along with other things. I was hoping to be able to show the website, but I think it's I've got a lot of different kinds of, all my publications are there. I mean, if you're a graduate student, my biggest advice to anybody is get a website and put absolutely everything on it. You sneeze, you put it on your website, because this is very important that you make sure that people have access to your work. Don't be afraid of copyright or anything like that. It's like, these things are. I hesitate to call it self-promotion, but in this game, it really is. You want to be able to show people what you're doing, and I've done that for a number of years now to great effect. So if you want to take a look at this PowerPoint and all the documentation that comes before it as background, please feel free. So I'm going to talk about, as you can see here, the current issues around second language development in Canada, some of the history that goes into it. But I want to get into the question of plurilingualism, bilingualism. What are these animals? Because at least within North America, I'm probably safe in saying also in Europe, plurilingualism is one of the big issues right now. What is it? What does it do? What are the effects of plurilingualism? This relatively, new old concept, because I want to problematize the concept as well. And what effects does it have on policy and, of course, actual teaching practice? I think there are some profound things that we can talk about. It's related to a publication that is in press that I've worked on with my colleagues, which we reviewed the literature, the more recent literature in English anyway, that has to do with plurilingualism. And we try to figure out what are the practical implications of this concept. So, and I've got an expanded version of that publication on the website that you might want to take a look at a little bit later. So before I begin, what is plurilingualism to you? Is it a concept that's been thrown around a lot here in Germany, or is it, I'm sure it's not something new. What do you understand by plurilingualism? Using the Socratic method. Is it familiar to you? Have you heard this concept before? Have you heard the term? Okay, good. So you're somewhat familiar with it. Okay. Well, I'm going to problematize it. I think it's a bit of a problem. So, and it's a bit of a controversial problem, and I've had some discussions with my colleagues about this. So it's one of those relatively new concepts that I think really should be interrogated more carefully than it actually is. But first, I want to go into what the current issues and what are some of the historic issues related to second language in my context in Canada, which, as you probably know, is a bilingual nation, officially a bilingual English-French nation. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that we're a settler country with a long history of European settlement, and then that's very problematic, which I'll talk a little bit about later on in the PowerPoint. But basically, we have a tremendous amount of different kinds of ethnicities and, of course, the languages that are associated with those ethnicities. So in the last census, the 2021 census in Canada, there were, as you can see here, 450 ethnic origins. And I didn't even know that was, and so virtually every ethnic group on the planet is represented somewhere in Canada. And that's because of the history. We've got more people than not talking about themselves as being Canadian. This is a problem demographically, right? This is a recent change in the way that stats are covered in Canada. It used to be you were forced to come up with some kind of linguistic or ethnic background that was not Canadian. But we have a lot of people who are now claiming Canada as their ethnicity, whereas before we used to say you were always hyphenated in some way. But we have, as you can see here, a lot of English people, a lot of Irish people, a lot of Scottish people, and a lot of French people. So we have lots of different other ethnicities. You can see here over 1 million people from Italian, Chinese, Ukrainian, East Indian, Dutch, and Polish descent. This is how Stats Canada represents it. But of course, you can see here, there's a few problems with the stats, right? So it doesn't differentiate between different ethnicities that are Chinese, not even linguistically. We can't figure out from these stats what Mandarin speakers are as opposed to Cantonese speakers, for example. We have all kinds of different ethnicities lumped together. So some people, like my own family background is Irish, so some people would say, no, that's part of the UK. And so you've got some problems statistically here from a researcher's point of view. But it's all to say we've got quite a variety of different people within the country. In terms of languages, there are, well, again, almost every major language on the planet is represented within the country, 200. And more importantly, this breaks down in terms of language use. 58% of the people in Canada as a whole speak English at home. 18.2% speak only French at home. So this is sometimes called the big solitude within the Canadian nation state, where is, at least a great percentage of the people cannot speak to each other in another language. So of this, 20% spoke another language at home. So we have all these various ethnicities. We have a lot of people who are speaking indigenous languages, 213,000. 6.5% reported not knowing an official language. So that's people who do not know, at least in terms of a working knowledge of the language, they do not know either English or French. So it's quite a large percentage. 17.5% reported being able to speak both English and French. So even though we're a bilingual nation officially, constitutionally, in terms of policy, in terms of actual language use, only 17.5% people are able to speak both English and French. So this means, what does it mean to be a bilingual nation when you have such a large percentage who cannot speak both languages? And then we have all kinds of mother tongues, and I know that's a problematic term, mother tongues, but anyway, we've got people who have significant increases in language use in Mandarin, Arabic, Hindi, Creole, Bengali, Persian, and Spanish. All of these depends upon what is the most recent immigration to Canada, and a lot of that has to do with refugees. And we're probably going to get a lot of people from Palestine, I'm afraid, given the wars, and we have a lot of people coming in from the Ukraine as well. This is also quite especially true in Ottawa, which is a bilingual city, has traditionally been where a lot of refugees will go to. The Canadian government really wants to push for immigration outside of the major centres, outside of Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver, to go to other cities, and Ottawa is in particular push to get people, especially refugees, to go into that particular city. My neighborhood, I live in South Ottawa, the majority of my neighbors are Muslim. And so this is because of targeted immigration and refugees within our nation, our city. Now, in terms of indigenous languages, you probably know a little bit about the history. It's a pretty ugly history in Canada. But in any case, we have over 1 million people who are claiming indigenous an ancestry of one way or another. Métis, that's a mixture of, usually it's French and native people, are up to almost 500,000. Inuit, that's people who live in the north part of the country. As you can see here, quite a sizable number. Now, what's interesting too is that First Nations birth rates are the highest amongst all Canadian ethnic groups. So some cities, such as, say, Winnipeg, if you're familiar with the nation state, have a large percentage of Indigenous people. Now we're talking about small numbers. Saskatchewan, for example, I think, well, I can't venture the number, but these are people, or say provinces that might only have 1 million or 2 million people within it, and a large percentage of those people are Indigenous. Now, this, of course, is after a first contact settlement. We have very limited estimates as to how many pre-contact native people lived in North America. But some people have argued that it's 200 million, but at least 90 million people, I think it's quite clear, quite safe to say, lived in the Americas at the first time of first contact with Europeans. And of course, the major declines from the disease, war, economic destruction, and I would argue deliberate government policy. We've had a long history of, in Canada, I'll be a bit opinionated here. Canada likes to, we officially like to pat ourselves on the back and say we're not as bad as the Americans. However, if you take a look at some of the documentation, Datchuk, for example, has a great text on how Canadian government policy has also been very similar to American policy in the way that it pushed Native people off the plains in terms of settlement. Now, this is quite a dramatic drop, so probably the worst example was the Haida in Western Canada, in British Columbia. The decline was tremendous. You know, as you see, 6,000 people recorded in 1835, down to 588 people left in 1915. Now, there's a lot of work being done by different groups that I hope I can get into this a little bit later in the discussion as to how immersion programming has been used in an attempt to revitalize or to recover some of these languages. Haida, for example, have a large immersion, Haida immersion program. We'll talk about that a little bit more. So this is a lot of parallels with French immersion programming, which Canada is quite famous for. So, immigrants coming into the country. And one thing that's important to note is that we might be nice people, I'm not too sure, but it's because it has a very important economic benefit to the country. Basically, it's because we have a falling Canadian-born birth rate, quite dramatic, you know, like a lot of other countries, Japan, for example, and other countries. We are really dependent upon migrants and immigrants for the economic growth. So in each one of the several years in the past, Canada has welcomed something, as you can see here, 260 migrants, 200,000 temporary foreign workers. This is a recent demographic to our country, and at least 10,000 refugees. But this is going to be increased in the next couple of years. We're talking now about 500,000 immigrants per year coming to Canada. This is official government policy. So it's going to be quite a challenge because we already have, of course, like every other country, different kinds of economic pressures that are being put on the nation state. But it's been quite strongly endorsed by almost every segment of the Canadian establishment that we need immigrants because we need to have economic growth, particularly in the north. Often we say, I mean, only half jokingly, that climate change, you know, we're one of the countries that might benefit, quote unquote, from climate change in the sense that it will open up huge, vast areas of the north to agriculture. Underneath the permafrost, in the northern parts of the country, lies extremely good soil for agriculture. So one of the arguments has been that we need immigrants to open up the north. Now, climate change, of course, is terrible. You know, it's going to really affect a lot of things, and it already, of course, has. But one of the arguments is that for economic growth, this might be of some benefit to some people, not to most people. So, current trends. 20% of Canada's population was foreign-born, as I say, people born outside of Canada. 1 in 5 people have not been born in Canada. This is the highest percentage of any of the Western industrial nations. So we have huge numbers of people coming from Asia, and statistically, people from the Middle East are lumped into the Asian bracket for some reason. There's a lot of problems with these stats, I gotta say, from an academic point of view. But in any case, we have immigration from Africa, the Caribbean, Central and South America. These are increasing numbers. And the traditional immigration that we've had historically from the United States and Europe has been decreasing quite dramatically. There was a time where almost, we had, I can't get into the history into too much detail, but we had huge embargoes on different kinds of immigration. You could probably count on 2 hands the number of Chinese who were brought into the country from 1920, I believe it was. You know, huge embargoes on all kinds of different people. So Jews couldn't come in, blacks couldn't come in, different Asian groups couldn't come in. So there's a lot of, go to my website and I'll have lots of stuff on that, right? Lots of different, the history is particularly ugly. So when you know, Canadians may be nice people, but some ugly history there. So the vast majority of foreign-born people who are coming to Canada will settle in Ontario, British Columbia, Quebec, and Alberta, particularly the urban centers, these big cities. Toronto, for example, right now is the third largest city in North America, behind New York, Los Angeles. It now is larger than Chicago. And that's because of immigration, tremendous numbers of immigration. Most of these people who live in these urban areas live very close to the American border. Something like, I can't remember the exact stat, but the vast majority of people live within 100 kilometers of the US border. It gets cold in Canada, so people, of course, are going to be as far south as they can, but it's also because of the American effect. You know, a lot of what we do internationally and so on is strongly influenced by the Americans, of course. I should say the United States of Americans. We've got some, of course, disputes about that too. So, since 1971, multiculturalism has been an important aspect of Canadian state policy. It's important to note that this is multiculturalism within a bilingual framework. We are not a multilingual country, we're a bilingual country and a multicultural country. So this is different from some places such as Australia, for example. Pierre Trudeau, is the father of the current Prime Minister, argued in 1971 that bilingualism is essential for Canadian unity, and immigration is essential for Canada's economic growth. It's in response to the discontent that was expressed, particularly by immigrant groups in the West, for the designation of French and English as official languages. English and French have been officially the official languages of the country for not that long, really. It's only from the 1970s. There has been, of course, an informal agreement between the two solitudes, as it were, between the English and the French. But this wasn't codified really until the 70s. No subsequent government, now I'm talking conservative governments, socialist government, liberal government, has seriously challenged the need for significant numbers of immigrants. Now there's been rhetoric occasionally, sort of anti-immigrant, sort of, I wouldn't call it anti-immigrant, so say people on the conservative side might express discomfort with the current levels of immigration, but the business community is quite strongly in favor of this kind of immigration because of the economic factors I've talked about. So no matter what the rhetoric you might hear sometimes, conservative governments or liberal governments have all been strongly and have strongly endorsed large numbers of immigration in the country. So a little bit of the history. I'll go through this fairly quickly. The Royal Commission on Bilingualism and Biculturalism in the 60s led to the Official Languages Act in 1969. In 1971, there was the Multicultural Act, which preserved, which hoped to ensure that different racial and cultural diversity was enshrined. The Canadian Constitution was framed in 1982. Fairly recent development, eh? Some people don't realize that we haven't had a constitution in this country, or I should say in Canada, since 1982, fairly recent. Canadian foreign policy, military policy, and so on, was dictated to us by the British as recently as 1931. When the British Empire declared war against, some countries, in the First World War, Canada was automatically in it. There was no question. In the Second World War, again, when Britain, the UK, declared war against a couple of countries, we went through, the rubber stamping in Parliament of endorsing it. But there was no real question that we would join the UK in whatever wars they wanted us to fight. So this has changed a little bit, but there's the question, right, of which empire do we follow now, right? It's not necessarily the UK, but we are, of course, following the next empire, the current empire. In any case, in 1982, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms was enacted as well. And you can see this is a slightly ambiguous statement. And the Constitution enshrines English and French as the official languages, but this is the only constitutional reference to multiculturalism. So this charter shall be interpreted in a manner consistent with the preservation and enhancement of the multicultural heritage of Canada. This is the only thing constitutionally that guarantees multiculturalism. But as I say, politically, economically, it's very difficult for any party or any group, I should say, to challenge it. English and French are often referred to as the two founding cultures, which again is problematic from many different points of view, since the demographics, of course, are changing quite dramatically. Now, a little bit about Quebec, because Quebec, of course, is the major French-speaking province in the country. There's been a lot of controversy about how the French language is preserved, or is meant to be preserved within Quebec. Of course, these are all meant to address historical inequities. Until the Quebec Quiet Revolution in the 1960s and 70s, the dominant power structures within the province were English-speaking. And there's lots of stories about how French speakers could not get jobs in Quebec, their own province, because they weren't English ethnicity, or their English wasn't completely fluent, and as, of course, problematic as that term is. So you've got different kinds of bills that have been enacted. The most recent one argues that English speakers, in most public cases, public cases, the Quebec government's not going into homes and telling people what to speak, but in public, there's more and more pressure to speak French rather than English. And of course, this is fairly controversial. Some people have argued that this is unconstitutional and so on, but this is the current state. You can see that progressively, the Quebec government, and this doesn't matter if it's a socialist Quebec government or a conservative government, has slowly tried to strengthen the French language through this kind of legislation. Also, what's happening, and that this is across the country, is French immersion programming. Now, there is English immersion programming within Quebec in particular, but the predominant form of immersion programming has been French. And there was, again, a history of this. This started with pilot projects within English-speaking communities in Quebec in the 60s. There was an expansion of French immersion federally, and you can see that there's different ways of going about framing different forms of bilingualism. And go to my website if you want to see all the theoretical background, it's all there, and more of this history. But basically, there's this question about whether or not you're teaching French in these French immersion programming for intrinsic purposes or instrumental purposes. So, for example, in my hometown in Richmond, British Columbia, it's a large Asian community. So over half of the people who live in this particular suburb of Vancouver have Asian origins. They either have parents who are from Asia, not necessarily Chinese, but also South Asian and so on. This is the largest French immersion programming in the country. And if you're going down to downtown Vancouver, you would have a hard-pressed time to find people who speak French. It's not like Ottawa, as Thomas points out. You hear French all the time, especially in my institution, which is a bilingual institution. But in other places, like in Vancouver, in the western part of the country, it's difficult to find French speakers at times. So why is it that so many immigrant groups from Asia who are living in Richmond, British Columbia, are in these kinds of French immersion programming? It's probably because it's from an instrumental motivation. They realize that this is the second or one of the official languages, so it's important for their children to know this language in order for career purposes. It's not necessarily intrinsic. So a lot of people, a lot of my scholars, my colleagues have problematized this in terms of what is the motivation here behind learning French. So it's important to note that, in view of these stats, that the goal of French immersion is not necessarily to produce a nation of bilingual, fluent speakers across the country. It has a political, and some people would say an ideological purpose, that you want to reinforce the nation state as a bilingual state by showing respect for the other language, not necessarily learning it. Now, there's a lot of controversy. I'm in teacher education. So there's a lot of controversy about what happens at the end of French immersion, why is it that so many of our students who go through secondary school education cannot speak French, even if they're in French immersion programming? Now, they might be able to write French, they might be able to conjugate those languages, to get the genders right and so on, but they cannot necessarily, in most cases, use French as an everyday working language. So this is, my kids are good examples. Until we moved to Ottawa, and until they spent some time in France, my kids, who went through French immersion programming from a young age, couldn't speak French to save their lives. You know? So they had to be in immersion in an actual French-speaking environment in order to start producing French. I'm a good example too, actually, of that. I had to pass my French exams, or else I'd lost my job. Now, my institution's a bilingual institution. I have to have passive bilingualism. In other words, I have to be able to understand French. And most of my colleagues, most of the meetings I attend are predominantly in French, because French is used as the driving force within my institution, which it's a good thing. But I dare not speak my French is so terrible. I would be embarrassed if I tried to speak it in front of my colleagues. So I try my best. I'm a very bad language learner. You say middle-aged men buy sports cars to compensate for something. I'm probably a second language teacher because I'm compensating for something else. In any case, so I would argue, I'm echoing some of my colleagues here, that it's not really a program designed to produce fluent speakers. It's a program designed to make sure that the nation state is united behind this concept of it being a bilingual nation state. So, what is the current state? Canadians reported being able to conduct a conversation in both English and French. Only 18%. Quebec is the only province in which the rate of bilingualism has risen in recent years from 40% to 46%. In recent years, the rate of bilingualism in the rest of Canada, in English Canada, has gone down. Not slightly, but it has gone down. Most Canadians speak English at home on a regular basis, and only 22% speak French at home on a regular basis. This has increased slightly, but not in terms of the overall population growth. We have 5% population growth, but a 1% increase in French speakers. So, French is in trouble in some ways. So these are the tensions that are related to all of these stats. We have a declining rate of French speakers, especially outside of Quebec. French has traditionally been, in Canada, across the entire nation state, particularly in the north. However, French speakers outside of Quebec are actually declining. And this is especially true of the current generation growing up. English is becoming much more, predominant within Western Canada and Central Canada. French is being basically relegated to Quebec and to New Brunswick. This is the other bilingual province within the country. So we have an increasing number of English-speaking immigrants. This is policies attempt to compensate for this. So the Quebec government is adamant that it wants to welcome French speakers predominantly into Quebec, but the vast majority of immigrants who are coming into the country are English speakers, other second language, predominantly English speakers. So of course this leads to an anxiety about the survival of the Francophone language and culture. There's been a pressure to drop the notion of two founding cultures to be more inclusive of Indigenous and second language immigrants. This is a major political issue within the country. You might have heard about the residential school controversy, the discovery of mass graves of Indigenous children in residential schools. It's a horrible scandal. It's thousands of unmarked graves of Indian Native children have been covered in different schools. At a certain point, the Canadian government forced the separation of families. This is to say, children were taken from their indigenous families and brought to the south into residential schools, where a lot of them died. So this is a raging controversy right now. And there is increased political autonomy of Nunavut, which is the most northern territory within the country, where English and French are rarely spoken as first languages. So what do you do in that circumstance? There is, of course, economic and political pressure to increase immigration in the face of declining native, I should say Canadian-born birth rates. There's an aging native-born population. I'm among those people. But so, you know, the argument is, how are they going to afford my pension if the population is declining? It's a major problem. The biggest problem, I would argue, from my point of view. Anyway, so what do you do in this case? And you have to bring immigrants in for not just the economic benefit of industry and so on, but also for the different demographic pressures that are under the way. There's attempts to reconcile with native groups in the face of these recent recognitions of historic genocides. There is an effect of global warming on Canada's north, or not just the north, but of course global warming is affecting everybody everywhere. Global pressures are related to, of course, war, so many wars, and of course the economic crises that are associated with them. And there's recent pressures to increase language immersion programming, especially within Quebec. There's a lot of pressure now from a lot of Quebec parents for English language programming in immersion education. So in terms of second language learning and teaching, trying to get to some practicalities here, how should language be taught? I mean, if we're talking about instrumental versus integrative motivations for learning a second language, what does that mean in terms of how we teach the language in the classroom? Now, grammar-based instruction emphasizes standard languages, has been something that has been favored in Quebec. Part of it is the legacy of French pedagogy, which you probably know is relatively didactic, as opposed to, say, North American. But there's also this question, how do you preserve the language unless you preserve some kind of standard of the language? English is okay, right? It's a world dominant language, you know, imperial, you know, we've sort of won many different wars, and, you know, the technology and so on. So you could argue that English is in a good position. We don't care about grammar. Why not? You know, one of my colleagues, one of my French colleagues said to me, well, aren't you worried about the poor grammar of English language speakers? I said, no. In English, we don't care. We don't care what the language is as long as you get the message across. But in French, it's very different. And as I say, part of that is the pedagogy, the traditional pedagogy, but also the need to preserve that language. And one of the controversies within my institution has been, you know, what variety of French are we talking about? Are we talking about metropolitan Parisian French, if there's really such a thing? Are we talking about Quebec French? Or are we talking about Franco-Ontarian French, you know, French within Ontario? There are different kinds of varieties. I mean, the Franco-Ontarian French is a real mad mixture of English and French because of the history there. And I've had colleagues who have actually corrected other French-speaking colleagues in faculty meetings for their poor grammar because they're not speaking correct French. So, I mean, humorous to a certain extent, I agree, and from an English point of view, it's sort of ridiculous. But when you talk about how do you preserve the French language in this particular circumstance, I do have some sympathy for that position. Now, do you teach grammar-based, which is often called the traditional form of language teaching, or do you do it in functional approaches, and sometimes called plurilingual or translanguaging instruction, which is the big current, it's the fashion right now, at least within North America. And now this is what's currently favored in English-speaking milieus. I mean, I could argue that, you know, this Hallidayan linguistics and so on has been in the English world for a long time, but, you know, it hasn't been very well received in continental or French-speaking milieus at all. So, how do you approach language teaching? Do you approach it from a grammatical standard language point of view, or do you try to emphasize the practicalities of learning the language through these kinds of plurilingual approaches? Now, so much time, so many things, the typical academic thing. Please, if you want to interrogate some more of this stuff, I've got this website here, I got all kinds of stuff there. So I'm someone who, I've problematized plurilingualism, especially in the latest publication I had with my colleagues. But I also am trying to get my head around some of these functional notions of language, and I've used Michael Halliday's work, Gilles Deleuze's work, and so on, if you know any of these big names. And I've tried to use it as a criticism of the notion of the language of the native speaker. It's been problematized in the English language milieu for a while now, but it's something that I think is a real problem in terms of the hierarchies of language. Some people have argued, I would agree, English is a relatively easy language to learn. Relatively. Subject, verb, object, word order, pretty consistent. You don't have to worry too much about gender. You don't have to worry too much about declination and so on. Relatively easy to learn at a basic level, as you probably know. To learn it to a level of what we might call fluency is difficult. There's a reason why English spelling is bad. It's because it's the barrier that keeps most people learning the second language down here and elevates native speakers up here, right? It's a wonderful, wonderful imperial tool, I argue, because it makes sure that everyone who wants to flip hamburgers at McDonald's gets enough English so they can do the job for minimum wage, but it doesn't allow them to get into the hierarchy, into the elite forms of English language learning and the jobs that are connected with it without a lot of work. I mean, lots of jokes I can say about English spelling and English. You know them as well as I do, right? It's difficult to learn English on that sort of basic competence into some kind of higher competence. As I say, I think it's purposeful. We could have corrected the spelling. We could have, just like the French have, they have the Académie Française. We could have an Académie Anglais, right? Correct all that spelling, make all the grammatical stuff, all the subjunctive, get rid of all that stuff. We're not going to do that. Why would we want to do that, right? It gives me a job, gives me a really good job, and and I can teach English worldwide and so on. I can just walk off the plane and teach the damn stuff, right? Because I'm a native speaker. Right? It's I think it's a beautiful system. And of course, I talk about critical multiculturalism. What does that really mean? Pedagogical choices, so on and so forth. So I want to end there, but I encourage you, if you want to take a look at more of my stuff, feel free to do so. And you can copy, steal, whatever you want. I'm at the point in my career that I don't need to protect anything. You can steal whatever you want if you want to do that. But if you want to argue with me about something, please do. I'd love to welcome a discussion and comments and beyond today, if it's possible. So, are there any questions, comments? It's a hard act to follow, Thomas. It's hard to follow your introductions. I hope I did okay.
Excellently. So thank you very much for this insightful talk. I think we all have learned quite a lot, and we can now open the Q&A session, which can be done in English, French, and German.
Yeah.
So
I'm here for a couple of days too. I'm not just going to get on the plane and take off because I want to explore Saarbrücken a little bit. So I'm open to discussing things even beyond today if people want.
Fragen, wie gesagt, auf Deutsch, Englisch, Französisch.
Vous parlez français et vous parlez des problèmes d'intégration. Vous avez donné quelques chiffres, effectivement. L'année 2015, nous avons eu 10 000 réfugiés de Syrie, uniquement de la région de la Saar. C'est-à-dire ici nous avons une population de 1 million et nous sommes en face à intégrer pas mal de gens qui parlent des langues entièrement différentes. À la frontière, effectivement, il y a des Français qui viennent ici, on parle ensemble. C'est effectivement une langue qu'il faut apprendre ici dans notre région, mais nous sommes en face de différentes langues. L'arabique, c'est la première langue qu'il faut apprendre, effectivement, ou bien il faut trouver une forme de la communication pour travailler avec les gens. Traditionnellement, ici dans notre région, il y a pas mal des émigrants d'Italie. C'était toujours la première langue étrangère dans la région de la Saar. Et puis la Turquie et maintenant le russien ou bien l'Ukraine. Nous sommes en face effectivement des problèmes similaires. Moi, je suis un représentant de la Chambre des métiers de la Saar et nous sommes en face avec ce problème. Nous cherchons des techniques de l'éducation pour que les jeunes soient bien intégrés. Pour les vieilles, ça provoque des problèmes. On n'arrive plus à communiquer nos techniques des métiers parce qu'il n'y a pas un niveau de communication. Mais pour les jeunes, à mon avis, c'est nécessaire qu'ils apprennent l'allemand tout d'abord. Et en même temps, nous cherchons également un chemin, une piste pour démarrer la communication. Et vous avez pas mal des expériences en Canada. Je me pose la question, qu'est-ce qu'on peut apprendre pour nous, pour notre situation ici, dans notre région?
It's a difficult question, Nate, because it's different. The immigration quotas that we have in Canada have two poles. One is, and I should have emphasized it a little bit more, we have family integration, and then we have skilled worker integration. And as I say, I emphasize the economic purposes, but also what the Canadian government often will do is they'll play with the numbers. So at different times they'll integrate, they'll encourage family integration, and other times they'll favor skilled worker integration. And the reason they do that is because if you have families coming into the country rather than single people, I guess single men mainly, if you have families coming in, you can integrate the entire family into much more stable kinds of environments. So, as I say, in my neighborhood, it's majority of people who live there are Muslim. That's purposeful, because if you have a Muslim population, it will keep the young men under control, basically. That's what it comes down to. But if you're bringing in individual young men who have trouble finding work, integrating into the country, facing racism and so on, then you're asking for trouble. So this is whenever there's an increase in immigration tensions, the Canadian government will increase the numbers of family integration. Now, we have a luxury because we can bring in as many people as we want, basically, from different kinds of countries. So we're not right beside Syria, we're not beside Ukraine, so the difficulties you're facing are much greater than the ones that we have. But that's the sort of philosophy that the Canadian government has adopted. It's this tension between the two. I don't know if that answered your question or.
Bien sûr. Effectivement, nous avons une autre situation. Il faut comprendre tous les gens, même les Allemands qui ne sont pas tout à fait d'accord avec les processus d'intégration comme ils ont démarré.
Yeah, it's a problem. I stayed for a few days in Frankfurt before coming here, and I stayed in a hotel that was close to the railway station.
Yeah.
And I could see a lot of problems,
Yeah.
a lot of tensions, there. So I don't know. I mean, there are tensions in Canada. You know, we got problems too, but I mean, we've got a few luxuries that we don't have to face as much as you have to face. Yeah, it's a big problem. It's a big problem.
Est-ce qu'il y a d'autres questions, d'autres weitere Fragen? Are there any further questions? Which I hope.
I'd like to go back to the pedagogical part of the talk here.
Okay.
Because personally, I am a very strong skeptic of learning languages at school because I find it very ineffective.
Yeah, me too.
And as someone from Lebanon, I've had ease in learning languages because I speak 3 from birth, practically.
Yeah.
So I don't face the same struggles that other students face in terms of learning certain languages because most of my English classes were English as a second language, so it was always easy. I never had to do anything. I'd like to hear more about what you think and your experiences in teaching English as a second language.
Yeah.
Well, it goes back to Stephen Krashen. If you know that scholar, he's still alive. He's still presenting. He in the night, I can't remember the years, but and he noticed that there was this difference between acquisition and knowledge, right? So you might have a really good knowledge of the grammatical structures of English without the command of actually using the language. So he made this big distinction. And some people I know dislike Stephen Krashen. I happen to like him as a scholar. I think he made some very important gains. I mean, we can criticize his pseudo-scientific stuff, and I understand that. But I mean, I agree that there is this big distinction to be made between one's explicit knowledge of the language. Usually, we talk about it in terms of grammar knowledge, and one's actual ability to use it. I mean, I'm a good example of the failure of that kind of grammatical approach. I mean, I'm afraid to speak French. I think I can barely understand it, really. But I had many, many years of French instruction in classrooms. So just like yourself, I have found it very, very ineffective. So, but the question is, I mean, how do we approach the teaching of French within that particular political environment where the preservation of language is a key thing? So I sort of have sympathy for French teachers who teach grammatically, but at the same time I say, well, this really is old pedagogy that is not very effective ultimately. Not that grammar is terrible. I mean, grammar has its place.
I completely agree.
Right? So, I mean, particularly, I think the research is quite clear in Rod Ellis and others. I mean, if you know any of these scholars, they've talked about how grammatical instruction is more effective with adults than with children. And I mean, there's some questions about the research there and how reliable that data is. But I happen to agree with that. I mean, at some point, I can appreciate grammatical instruction, but for most people, particularly for young people, it's not very effective.
I'd like to also add that I think the real big problem, the big problem I have noticed is that usually when you're imposing language learning at school, at least 80% of people are completely unmotivated and will try and do their bare minimum to pass the class and nothing more.
Yeah.
Which I think that therein lies the big problem, which you can't force someone to learn a language that they don't know unless you expose them to a predominantly X-speaking language.
Yeah. You send them to Quebec, like my kids, my children. You send them to Quebec or to France, or I guess you're lucky you can send them to what because it's across the river. So yeah, you're right. I mean, We found this too when we did research with Chinese rural teachers. I got something on my website about the research that we did in China. When we talked to teachers in rural China about teaching English in that milieu, it was like, there was no motivation whatsoever. Most of the kids in rural China have absolutely no use for English. And some of my English colleagues get upset about this. Don't they want to watch Hollywood films? No, they don't. No. So, I mean, there is the famous Gaokao, the famous university entrance examinations, which about a quarter of that now I think is based upon English instruction. But that kind of motivation, that sort of top-down motivation is, I think I agree, it's very ineffective. And those teachers in rural China were having a horrible time trying to teach English to kids who had absolutely no use for it, really. If they weren't going to go, if these kids were not going to go to Beijing or Shanghai and get a job where English might maybe needed, they had absolutely no use for it. So yeah, motivation is a real important thing.
I mean, it's really problematic to bridge this huge systematic gap between English and Chinese, for example.
Mm-hmm.
That's true. And those who are very motivated about grammar will become language teachers afterwards.
That's right.
Okay, Christina.
I just thank you very much for your very interesting presentation. I like very much, I appreciate the slide with the traditional French approach, I think, because I think that's the problem we have as well in the European school systems, that the French traditional system and this mindset of teaching French, it's so deeply entrenched. Okay, thank you. I think there we have, it's the same but different, of course, in our two different contexts. But I think that's one of the very important points concerning French teaching and learning somewhere in the world. Even in France, they still are teaching like that.
Yeah, I remember going to the Sorbonne in Paris a few years ago, and I sort of snuck in. I can't remember which one was it, 5 or 4? Anyway, one of the big ones. And I sort of wandered around the classrooms, and I was so amazed because there was a blackboard and seats that were bolted down, and I said, no multimedia anything. And in rural China, they've got at least PowerPoints and I said, what is this? I mean, you can't move the desks around, you can't, and the person who was showing me around said, well, this is not any place. This is the Sorbonne. This is what we do in the Sorbonne. And I said, okay, and I sympathize with that. I mean, you have maybe in North America we've gone too far, right? Because there is a very basic philosophy that I think is important to teach children. The history of thought and is sometimes lost, I think, personally. But on the other hand, there is, the critical notions are important too. So I agree with you.
Nous avons plusieurs Français parmi nous. Alors, est-ce que vous avez expérimenté un peu le même type d'enseignement des langues étrangères, ou est-ce qu'il y a quelqu'un qui a appris une langue étrangère de manière très communicative et fonctionnelle?
Moi encore, je peux parler de mon expérience personnelle en tant que quelqu'un qui parle au moins 4 langues. Et j'ai trouvé que le plus souvent, ce qui m'aidait le plus à progresser à chaque fois, c'était entendre parler les gens et parler avec eux en retour. C'est-à-dire que, en tout cas, surtout pour les langues à base orale, c'est-à-dire toutes les langues de la région ici. Parce qu'après encore, si on veut passer au mandarin, il y a encore à passer dans l'écrit. Et Et donc ça a fait que au final, plus j'étais exposé à la langue, mieux je la parlais, puisque j'apprenais comme un enfant, puisque je les ai appris jeunes les langues, donc j'imitais beaucoup. Donc ça, et cet apprentissage à l'imitation, ça donne une base très très solide pour commencer à apprendre la langue. Bien, évidemment, ça ne suffit pas, il faut commencer à pouvoir étaler sa pensée dans la langue, mais c'est une base presque parfaite pour commencer à apprendre une langue. Et même si on apprend la grammaire un peu plus tard, et la grammaire reste importante quand même, il faut bien commencer par, personnellement je trouve qu'il faut bien commencer par justement imiter la langue, imiter les sons, puisque justement ces langues-là ont commencé oralement, c'est-à-dire qu'on les a parlées avant de les écrire. Et oui, voilà, c'est ça.
Il y a quelque chose de très important dans ce que vous avez dit, parce que c'est à un moment donné qu'il faut quand même apprendre la grammaire.
Oui, évidemment.
Et c'est comme ça que ça s'apprend les langues. Tout enfant apprend sa langue d'abord par acquisition, et après c'est l'enseignement formel pour la grammaire, pour tout ça, pour les structures. Mais c'est surtout pour l'apprentissage précoce des langues, c'est ça le début et la base pour tout apprentissage de langue naturelle dès le début. Et après, il y a les autres facteurs qui commencent à jouer. Et vous allez voir qu'il y a beaucoup d'enfants des familles issues des familles migrants qui ont un très bon niveau à l'oral, mais comme vous l'avez dit tout à l'heure, il y a des barrières qui se prennent pas si facilement au prochain niveau de compétences.
Alors, imiter un environnement naturel, disons,
Oui.
dans une salle de classe, c'est pas évident. Ça, c'est le problème. Très bien. Est-ce qu'il y a d'autres questions? Gibt es weitere Fragen? Are there any further questions?
I noticed that. Oh, sorry.
The distinction between plurilingualism and multilingualism in Europe, right? Yes.
Yeah, this is my opinion, right? Because I'll have colleagues who will go after me with knives if they have a chance. So there's a long history, at least within English language teaching, of problematizing language standards. As you probably know, this question, if we moved in the 60s and 70s from a predominance on written forms to oral forms. Then we started as a profession to talk about the practicalities to teach English thematically, for example, the traditional settlement kinds of topics in banking and so on, banking, shopping, whatever. So there's been this long tradition for at least 30, 40 years now that there's this question of, is there really a language standard that we should be teaching? Now, this is a problem, right? Because if there isn't, then what on earth do you teach? This is a real tension. So multiculturalism, and you've got people like Jim Cummins and so on, so who talked about the progressive nature of multiculturalism, as to say, multilingualism, that you're not trying to erase the first language in order to introduce the second language. So there's this question, what is language learning anyway? If something goes in your head, does something have to go out? Is the brain finite? So the arguments are, that Cummins and others, that the brain is like a balloon. It's like the cosmos, right? It's like there's this expanding notion that you can put more than one thought in your head, you can put more than one language in your head. So you don't have to push something out in order to put something in. So this is the basis, I think, behind multilingualism and the connected multiculturalism. So multiculturalism, too, is, you don't have to push one culture out if you're pushing one culture in. So if you're integrating people into society, like in Canada, you do not have to abandon your first culture. Now you're going to have a hybridity, right? Of course, you know. I have Irish background, but I don't speak a word of Irish. But you know, I can say that my culture is sort of Irish Canadian kind of. But I've grabbed all kinds of different things. I like my Wiener Schnitzel too, right? So I've got all kinds of different things that go into my culture. So multiculturalism is this notion that you can combine different cultures, different languages in case of multilingualism. Now, plurilingualism is there's been a number of different variations on what plurilingualism is, but basically it argues that there is no such thing as a standard language. It's an artificial construct. Someone's put together a dictionary and a grammatical compendium and said, this is English, this is French. So plurilingualism challenges that, and it argues that it's okay not to be fluent in the second language. It's okay. Whereas, you know, I was taught when I took my teacher training that the goal is full fluency. I want my students to be able to speak English perfectly so they can get into university and so on and so forth, right? However, most of my students, you know, I taught in settlement programs for 20 years, most of my students were not going to university. They were more concerned with getting a job, a relatively good paying job, maybe getting a profession, you know, a trade or something like that. They were not worried about perfect English. And I used to think, oh, that's a failure, because I want them to learn fluent English. But I should have really thought of that as a victory. I gave them, I helped them learn enough English for their life goals. And that's beautiful, really. That should be something that's much more positively thought of in our game. So plurilingualism is this notion that you really don't need to be fluent in the language in order to be proud of that language. So there's a lot there, and I mean, you can go to my website and look at all the theory and it's all there. So take a look at some of these questions. You know, some people have argued, the names will come to me. Some people have argued that this is necessarily a progressive thing, that it is a liberatory notion that you don't have to gain full fluency, and you can have a mixture of language. Like if you walk around the University of Ottawa, probably as you walk around this campus here, you'll hear people speaking different languages all the time. English and French predominantly in Ottawa. Some people might say something in English, and the reply will be the same conversation. The reply will be in French. Or sometimes they'll speak half of the sentence in English, half of the sentence in French. We used to think of that as a failure. They should be consistent. But really, plurilingualism argues that that is actually a victory. People are using the language for practical, concrete purposes, and we don't have to worry so much about standard, fluent languages.
Is there, for example, a risk, in this case, that it will lead to the impoverishment of the language, for example?
I agree. This is the tension. This is not a simple matter, right? So, and I've had colleagues who've asked me, okay, so if plurilingualism, more properly, challenges the whole notion of a discrete language, then what do we teach? Yeah. Because we're going to teach grammatic. We have to teach vocabulary. We have to teach grammar. We have to teach use. So I do not know the answer to your question. But it's a big tension between the two. I agree.
I've had debates with a few friends of mine on whether or not there is an original Indo-European language. Like, as in the one Indo-European language that has started all the others that we speak now, because we can clearly see similarities between like English, French, German, even the Latin languages, the Germanic languages, and even like between Latin and like the original Germanic language, for example, you see similarities in the way they are constructed, and that's we've debated about it with a few friends, and I want to know if you have some kind of.
Well, this is not my area of expertise. But I will say this, I mean, remember that the notion of Indo-European languages really came out of, what was his name? Well, Saussure talked about it. But there's a long history. You know, I'm getting older, I can't remember all these names. You know, I used to pop them out of my head.
But the European dates back a little bit.
Yeah, yeah. But there is, I think there is a colonization or an imperial notion to that nation. Right? That there's a problematic, and I think associated with colonization. You know, if we say, what's his name?
I'm thinking about this as
Havelock. Remember Havelock? Remember Havelock used to argue. I mean, he's dead now, but he argued, I think, really problematically, that English was the epitome of languages because it had this long history going back to India and the Indo-European, the Sanskrit, and so on. And all these languages have developed, and you know the Greeks were big because they got rid of half of the letters in the phonetic in the Phoenician alphabet. So this proved that that the Indo-European languages were superior to others because they were more abstract, and Asian languages were very impoverished because they didn't do this. This whole argument that really basically implied that English was the language of progress, technology, and it wasn't just because of the accidents of empire, you know. Anyway, it was because this language was the logical one that has led to all of this kind of progress. So of course that's nonsense. We can say it's nonsense, but you know there is this problem with languages. It can be used as a tool, as a weapon. Quite strong, you know, it's being used all the time. I was going to say something about Palestine. I mean, every nation state, I think, has used language to a certain extent as a weapon. So you can see, I think, how that history, that supposed history, is also a weapon. Is English the most beautiful language, the most logical language?
That's what people say about French some centuries ago.
And Latin, of course, before that. So all these, you know, so I don't know. I'm not a historian, really. I don't know how to answer your question, but I think that's my sort of take.
Thank you for the insight.
But I mean, what we have to say is that the immediate comparability of languages, of Western languages, are mostly due to Latin. So if you think about the fact that half of the English vocabulary is French and Latin based, or Latin French based.
French based.
Latin as well, of course, Latin and French. That's amazing, and that's what we can feel. And it's only the
Enfin, c'est le cadre commun de référence pour les langues et cultures. Voilà. Là, il y a cette distinction entre multilingue en tant que plurilingualisme, comme enfin une personne, un individu est plurilingue,
oui.
Et la société ou une institution est multilingue.
Oui. Oui.
Donc c'est la séparation que l'on trouve très très souvent ici chez nous en Europe. Et enfin, je suis dans un projet au sein du Centre européen European Center of Modern Languages. Et là-bas, on avait écrit des textes pour un cours en ligne et on avait utilisé le translanguaging comme une approche pour faire entrer les langues des participants. Et le ECML, ici, nous a dit non, il ne faut pas prendre ça, on ne veut pas savoir quelque chose du translanguaging, s'il vous plaît, n'utilisez pas ça. C'est tout récent. Et ça, c'est vraiment très très intéressant parce que c'est vraiment contraire à ce qui se passe chez vous, apparemment.
Because I have colleagues who say colleagues at the University of British Columbia, where I got my doctorate, will say that translanguaging is it, and plurilingualism is, well, that's garbage. they'll say it's reactionary politically, but translanguaging is progressive. But then I have colleagues at the University of Toronto, that's where I got my master's, who say the exact opposite. And as you say, the European tradition is to talk about individual, but in North America, the tradition is to talk about it in terms of policy and that sort of thing. So yeah, so one of the points we make in the book chapter, the journal article that we're writing is that there's all these turf wars going on between different academics, and really, the English phrase, the proof is in the pudding. What is the real concrete ramifications of any of this stuff? Because you can call yourself you can call yourself a critical multilingualist, like that's what Jim Cummins calls himself, or you can talk about yourself as a translanguaging prof, or it's all how you get these turf wars between different academics.
So Professor Li Wei was the #1 in translanguaging in the world, who I had the honor of meeting in London, will not be happy hearing that.
I imagine we were not happy.
No, not at all. I guess.
Yeah, no, I mean it's depressing sometimes when you hear the latest fashions within academia, right? Because a lot of it just leaves practitioners, aghast. Like, well, why are they arguing about this stuff? It has, it depends on who you read. Well, it's fun. It's fun. From an academic point of view, it's fun. But from a practitioner's point of view, it must be very frustrating.
So you have Professor Fleming's email address. You can always, I hope you won't criticize me for that. You can always write to him.
I love arguing about this stuff. So if you have comments, please feel free. I want to talk to people afterwards, but I'm open. If you have a great thought or something, a great question after in a day or two, please email me. It's great. I didn't come to Saarbrücken just for like an hour. I mean, I'm here to really understand what the tensions are here. I can see a lot of similarities, but also differences. I'm learning a lot by coming here. I've got to say thank you so very much for teaching me.
Thank you very much for teaching us. So we quickly come to the applause section. I would like to thank everyone, instructor at the other campus of our university, teaching in the Franco-German University Institute, teaching interculturality. Mr. Wilfried Schmidt, who is the former director, now also retired former director of as a part-time teacher after that, which I'm very happy about, and who is was my predecessor as the president of the. I want to hide something for the time being. There's something, and now it works. There is something from Saarland. I told you I'm not a born but a learned Saarlander, having lived here for 15 years at Bilingual and Bock. This is the very company of Saarland to produce products like these.
Oh, okay. So I've heard of these.
It's China from Saarland.
Kingfisher, my favorite bird.
And then, this is really fresh from the press. As you know, I have been organizing the Saarbrücken conferences on foreign language teaching, Saarbrücker Fremdsprachentagung, Congrès Saarbrückois de l'enseignement des langues étrangères. And in the context of these conferences, we have been, which have been going on from 2011 on, we have been traditionally publishing books. And there has been a French book for the last conference, or actually previous one, which took part in 2021 already. A German book, a French book, and this is the English book. And I've had the honor to have had Professor Fleming as the co-editor of this book. I got it just before. It's fresh from the press. It's fresh from the press, and this is actually.
I don't have a copy yet.
Go ahead.
Thank you so much.
Sorry for giving you a bit more luggage than you have otherwise.
It's fine.
So let me put it forward. Thank you very much. I'm very happy. Thank you. And thank you very much. Did you take this picture?